Hello, and welcome to our study of Luke and Acts that we are doing throughout this year. This is going to be focused on Luke chapter 6, and there's a lot of good stuff in this chapter. There's a lot of stuff in this chapter, so we're going to hit kind of the high points. But it starts off kind of continuing a theme that was picked up last week and what Tommy was talking about. And in chapter 5, we start to see this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees come out, and that conflict really builds up in chapter 6. We're going to see a lot of conflict starting off. And the first instance we see is Jesus and his disciples in the field plucking some grain, and Luke adds this detail that they were rubbing it in their hands together. He's pointing out that it wasn't necessarily unlawful to pick grain on the Sabbath, to get grain. But of course, the Old Testament had a bunch of laws. They had a bunch of Sabbath laws on what you could and couldn't do. And of course, the Sabbath was a day of rest. But the Pharisees, especially up to this point, when Jesus is around, had started to add a bunch of different laws and interpretations of laws onto the Old Testament. And so what we get is this very strict outline of what is work, what isn't work. And to pick grain wasn't necessarily work, but to rub it in between your fingers, that was work. And so they're breaking one of the Sabbath laws by doing this. And I think we have to ask a question, because Luke puts these two stories back to back of Jesus and his disciples plucking grain intently on the Sabbath and Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath. Two things that they didn't necessarily have to do on the Sabbath. So Jesus is kind of stirring the pot a little bit in both of these stories, because in the next story we have him teaching in the synagogue, and he sees the Pharisees and the scribes in the corner, and it says that he knows what they were thinking, because there's this man with a withered hand there, and I guess they were waiting to see what he would do. Is he going to try to heal this man on the Sabbath? And of course he does in this next story. But why does Jesus do that? Like I said, he's kind of stirring the pot, because wasn't necessarily that this guy's hand had to be healed that day. And if it was a life-threatening illness, the Sabbath laws allowed for that to happen, allowed for something to, if you're saving somebody's life, then you can work to do that. But this man wasn't necessarily needing his life to be saved in the medical sense, I guess. So why does Jesus do this? I think he's kind of pointing out something that they didn't have their focus in the right place in these two stories, right? Especially in the first story, Jesus brings up this Old Testament story about David and the showbread from 1 Samuel chapter 21. And David and his men are on the brink of dying of hunger, right? In this story, like there's nowhere else to go. They're hungry. They're at their last leg. Like they need some food. And so they come up to the priest, and who's about to throw the showbread out, and they take it for themselves and eat it so that they can have the strength to keep on going. And so Jesus points to this story, and he says, okay, remember what David did, right? Which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, but he did that, and he gave it to those with him. I think Jesus kind of points out that, okay, in that story, there was something more important at work. There was the Sabbath law. And of course, when we talk about the Sabbath, and we talk about these two stories, it's very easy to point to the legalistic Pharisees, of course, but I think we need to give a little grace because the Sabbath laws were important, right? God commands the Israelites to keep the Sabbath, and all those laws around the Sabbath came from a place of okay, we don't want to do what God doesn't want us to do. We want to keep this day holy. This day is very important. And so it's easy for us to just write them off as crazy in this story. Like, I don't know why they put all these different laws in, but it came from a place of, at least for some people, I'm sure, people are complicated. Maybe it came from different motives, but they wanted to keep this day holy. And so, but Jesus is pointing to this story. Sorry, I thought it'd be really cool to be outside and let you hear the sounds of nature, and all the sounds I've heard so far are a bunch of dogs around me barking, but hopefully it's not too distracting. But Jesus is pointing to this story and he says, okay, look, there's the Sabbath laws that are important and need to be kept. But David and his men were dying of hunger. And no one says boo when they go in and they take some bread to stay alive. Something more important was there and was at work that trumped those Sabbath laws. Sabbath laws are important, but keeping David and his men alive was more important in that moment. There's something higher at work in that story. And so I think these two stories run together and point at that same theme of, okay, why did Jesus do this on the Sabbath? He could have done it any other day. That story doesn't say they were dying of hunger and they needed to get grain that day. Maybe they did, but the man didn't have to be healed that day. So why is Jesus doing this? And I think part of the reason is to point to his mission. He knew the Pharisees were going to be in opposition. He knew that they didn't necessarily like what he was doing and was going to do. And he points out this little detail to show, okay, the Sabbath is important, but there's something greater at work here. There's something greater than the Sabbath. He even says in verse 5, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. There is something greater in your midst that is happening. And you need to recognize what is going on. But of course they don't. And at the end of the second encounter on the Sabbath, we see that they are filled with rage and fury and started discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. And the plots really start picking up some speed against Jesus. But he doesn't let that stop him from his mission. He keeps on going. And we have this little excerpt right in the middle of the next big section. And we have in verses 12 through 16, where Jesus finally has gathered his apostles, the crew he's going to spend the most time with. And what I think is really cool about this story is in verse 12. Before he does that, it says, in these days, he went out to the mountains to pray. And all night long, he continued in prayer to God. And I think that's amazing. I don't think I've ever spent a whole night in prayer. And of course, who knows what that exactly means. No one was there with Jesus. They just know this guy went away for a long time. He was there praying. I think it points to the importance of prayer in Jesus' life, and the importance that prayer needs to be in our lives. We're actually, Tommy and I are here at Freed Hardeman for the lectureships this week, and they're actually covering the book of Luke in lectureships. And we listened to Dr. Ed Gallagher, who spoke yesterday, I believe. He's a professor at Heritage Christian University. He's a preacher in Alabama, and really, really sharp guy. Loved hearing him speak. But he he pointed out that one of the main themes in Luke that you see over and over again is the importance of prayer that keeps coming up. And this is a part that we see right here, how important prayer was to Jesus, and especially in big moments. And you think about how he, of course, we don't get the story in this part, we just get the names of the people, but we know a little bit of the backgrounds of these apostles. And I know I don't want to get too far ahead, but in Sunday mornings, a few of our members of our congregation are looking at this series, The Chosen. And I'm sure several people in our church have watched that video, or the video series. And what's really cool about that series is it focuses on what Jesus did to the people around him, the impact that he had on those lives of the apostles. And spoiler alert, in season 2, they really start to show some of the conflict between the apostles. You have people here from different backgrounds. Of course, you have Matthew, who's the tax collector, Simon, who's called the zealot, right? And then, of course, Judas, who became the traitor, like Luke says. They're, first of all, they're humans, okay? And they followed each other around for 3 years. I'm sure that there was some conflict there. And that's what the Chosen series does a good job of pointing out, of the possible conflicts that would have been brought up between all these different people from these different backgrounds. Even though they all come from a very similar background, they all come from very different backgrounds as well. And I'm sure that caused some butting of heads. Yet Jesus spends time, deep time in prayer before choosing these people, before making this decision final. And he says, okay, these are the ones I want to go with. And I think it, of course, points to the need of prayer in our own lives as well. The role that prayer should play, but also probably one of the hardest things to do as a Christian is to develop a deep prayer life like that. I wish I had the secrets and I could go on a tangent and tell you what all the secrets are to having a great prayer life. But I don't have those secrets. And if you do, I would love to know. Maybe you should be doing this one instead of me. But how can we make prayer a more important and a deeper aspect of our lives, especially when we're about to make big decisions? That's something we're talking about with the youth group right now on Wednesday nights is, all right, what do we do when we need to make big decisions? Where do we go? Who do we turn to? And of course, I think one of the biggest things as a Christian is before making any big decisions, before making any big moves, that we deeply spend time in prayer. And we don't get a glimpse of what this prayer looked like, but I can't imagine it's much different than the prayer that he prayed in the garden of ultimately, God, I may make a lot of wishes and commands, but I want your will to be done, and I want your will to come through. And I'm sure that's what he prayed, at least part of that night, and the prayer that we should always have, and a prayer that I continue to try to pray of God, may your will be done, even though I may not know what that looks like. But he collects his group, and then we get, maybe your version will say something about the Sermon on the Plain. We go on in 17, 18, and 19, crowds start gathering around him, and he starts healing people who are sick and all these different things that are going on. And then he goes into this beautiful sermon that sounds very similar to the sermon in Matthew. It starts off with the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who are hungry. Blessed are those who weep now, for they shall laugh. And of course, right off the bat, you notice, okay, I've heard this before. There are definitely some similarities to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. And as you can imagine, there's some debate. Okay, is this the same sermon? Is Luke just changing up some stuff? I don't think we can really know for sure. But I think what we can know is that if you were to go around and hear Jesus preaching or teaching at any part of his ministry, this is likely what you're going to hear. I was a counselor at Mid-South for 3 summers while I was at Freed Hardeman. It's a youth camp here close to Freed. And we had to deliver a Devo every week. And me and one of my friends one year used to joke at each other because we felt that every single lesson we had, mine would always gravitate toward this main theme of service. So no matter where I started, it was going to end most likely on we need to be better servants. And his, no matter where he started, most likely ended at the idea of we need forgiveness and who that forgiveness can come from. As preachers and teachers, we sometimes gravitate toward the things that mean the most to us and that connect the most to us. And a lot of times that comes up in my teachings. I know I start gravitating towards something that I feel deeply about and is familiar. And I think we get a little bit of what that is for Jesus. What is most important to him? If you were going to walk around and hear Jesus speak, what did he really want his followers to know? And I think that's what the Sermon on the Plain here in Luke and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew are for. To give you a glimpse into the teaching of Jesus, but also, okay, here's what Jesus really wanted his disciples to look like and to know and to model in their lives. And so he starts off with the blessings and then woes. And of course, we encourage you to go through these, read these deeper, especially the Sermon on the Plain, Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through the end of the chapter. And when we get the section on loving your enemies, doing good to those who are around you, not just repaying good for good, but repaying evil for good, repaying hurt for good, seeking to do good to those who are around you, to be merciful, a section on how we judge others, a section on a tree and its fruit, a reminder of what kind of fruit are we bearing. And then we get this parable that ends the Sermon on the Plain, that ends the Sermon on the Mount, about building a house. It says, verse 46, I'm going to read this section. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you to do? Now, it's important because it's coming right at the end of a sermon, right? It happens here in Luke and in Matthew that he mentions this. Everyone who comes to me and hear my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When the flood arose and the stream broke against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. So he gives us these powerful sermons, and he says to his audience, okay, now what are you going to do with it? You can either take this and build your life on these foundational aspects that I'm teaching about forgiveness, about love, about mercy, about following in my footsteps. And if you do that, he gives this promise almost. If you listen to these teachings, not just let them go in one ear out the other, but if you hear these, read these, and truly build your life around them, this is what it's going to be like. A house built on a strong foundation, so that when the waves and the winds of life come and beating against that house that you're building, it stands strong because it's built on a solid foundation. Of course, that's a story we've heard. If you're older, and especially if you grew up in the church, you've heard since you were young, right? But a message that we need to continually hear every single day of, okay, what am I building on, right? Especially when we hear teachings like this, we have to ask ourselves, okay, am I going to build my life on these principles that Jesus talks about? What is my life going to be built on? And I pray that as we read these, it can make an impact, a difference in our lives, and we can build on these words of Jesus. And that's Luke chapter 6. We thank you for tuning in for this series. Next week will be Luke chapter 7. So hopefully, maybe you read chapter 6 already. Maybe you read it again if you want. But next week we'll be looking at Luke chapter 7, if you want to go ahead and get a start on it. Thank you, and I hope you have a fantastic week.